Society must protect itself. As it claims the right to deprive the murderer of his life, so also it may prevent the defective germplasm from reproducing. Charles Davenport.
The perpetuation of defective strains of human heredity is a menace to the American people. Harry H. Laughlin.
It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr.
More children from the fit, less from the unfit. That is the chief aim of birth control. Margaret Sanger.
In 1924, Virginia passed a law allowing state institutions to sterilize patients who had been diagnosed as mentally deficient. The policy reflected the growing influence of eugenics, the belief that social problems such as poverty, crime, and disability were inherited, and that society could improve itself by controlling who was allowed to have children. Before the law could be widely used, however, it needed to survive a legal challenge. State officials needed a case that would establish the policy as constitutional. Carrie Buck became that case. Carrie was committed to the Virginia Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded in Lynchburg, a state institution created to house and control those considered unfit. There, physicians diagnosed her as feeble-minded and described her as mentally deficient, morally irresponsible, and incapable of independent life. In their judgment, her condition was hereditary. The diagnosis was presented to the court as medical fact. The state's argument centered on heredity. Officials presented what they described as 3 generations of defect. Carrie's mother, Emma Buck, had previously been confined to the same institution, and her commitment was offered as evidence of inherited mental weakness. Carrie's pregnancy outside marriage was cited as further proof of poor judgment and limited intelligence. Her infant daughter, Vivian, was described by examiners as showing signs of developmental delay. Taken together, officials argued, the Buck family represented a hereditary line of degeneracy. To support this claim, the state relied on the testimony of medical and institutional authorities from the colony. Dr. J. H. Bell, the superintendent, examined Carrie and approved her for sterilization.
She belongs to the shiftless, ignorant, and worthless class of antisocial whites of the South. The evidence shows that she comes from a line of feeble-minded people, and that if she is allowed to reproduce, there is a strong probability that her offspring will be of the same type. J. H. Bell, Superintendent of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded.
Experts warned that individuals like Carrie would require lifelong public support, increasing both the cost and the size of state institutions. Sterilization, they argued, offered a practical solution. It would prevent future dependency and reduce the long-term burden on society. The policy was presented not as punishment, but as a rational public health measure, efficient, preventive, and forward-looking. Virginia officials also argued that the state already exercised similar powers in the interest of public welfare. Society quarantined the sick and confined those considered dangerous. Sterilization, they claimed, was simply another form of protection, and the procedure itself was described as minor, safe, and beneficial. To the courts, the evidence appeared consistent and compelling. A hereditary condition, demonstrated across 3 generations, and unlikely to change. Virginia's judges accepted the testimony of the colony's experts and concluded that Carrie Buck was feeble-minded, that her condition was inherited, and that sterilization was medically and socially justified. The case moved through the state courts and was eventually appealed to the United States Supreme Court. In 1927, the court upheld Virginia's sterilization law. Writing for the majority, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. accepted the state's reasoning that the public welfare could justify preventing certain people from reproducing. He concluded with a sentence that would become one of the most infamous in American legal history.
3 generations of imbeciles are enough.
The court had defined Carrie Buck as feeble-minded, morally defective, and a hereditary burden. This is the story the court believed. Now, here is the story the court never heard. Carrie Buck was born into poverty in Charlottesville, Virginia in 1906. Her mother, Emma Buck, was left to raise the family alone after her husband abandoned them. Without steady income or support, Emma scraped by as a domestic servant, moving from job to job. Neighbors and local officials labeled her unstable and socially inadequate, judgments shaped more by her poverty than by any clinical evidence. In the early 20th century, eugenics cast a long shadow. Poverty, limited schooling, and any deviation from middle-class norms were routinely branded as feeble-mindedness. So in 1920, with no meaningful psychological testing by modern standards, only reputation, hearsay, and class prejudice, Emma was committed to the Virginia Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded. 7-year-old Carrie was then placed with foster parents, John and Alice Dobbs. At first, the home seemed stable. She attended public school through the 6th grade, where teachers described her as quiet, average, and perfectly capable. She did not leave school because she couldn't learn. The Dobbs family simply needed her labor at home, pulling her out to help with housework, a common demand placed on poor girls of that era, yet one that would later be twisted into supposed proof of her defectiveness. At 17, Carrie's life changed forever. She became pregnant after being raped by a relative of her foster family. Instead of protecting her or seeking justice, the Dobbses chose silence and shame. They had Carrie committed to the same Virginia colony where her mother was still held, both to hide the assault and to spare themselves embarrassment. That single, cruel decision set Carrie on the path to becoming the unwilling face of America's eugenics tragedy. A young woman who had never been given a fair chance, denied safety, education, and basic dignity, was now labeled feeble-minded and marked for sterilization. Her story is not one of inherited weakness, but of systemic betrayal. Her pregnancy became the state's opportunity. Eugenicists sought a legal test case to validate Virginia's sterilization law. Carrie appeared ideal for their narrative, a poor young woman already institutionalized, with a mother labeled feeble-minded, and a newborn child who could be presented as the 3rd generation of hereditary defect. Carrie Buck's story is not only about eugenics, it is about how institutions manufacture legitimacy. The case shows how law, medicine, and social prejudice can converge into a narrative that looks scientific but is built on class bias, gender control, and procedural manipulation. The Supreme Court's decision rested on 3 claims: that Carrie Buck was feeble-minded, that the condition ran in her family, and that her child showed the same defect. Later evidence showed that none of those claims were true.
The story the Supreme Court heard about Carrie Buck was built on 5 devastating lies. First, they said Carrie herself was feeble-minded, a moron whose mind was so limited she had to be sterilized for the good of society. What they never told the justices was that Carrie had sailed through public school to the 6th grade. Teachers called her quiet but perfectly average. The institution's own records described her as cooperative, capable, and ready for real work. After she was finally released, she lived independently, held steady jobs, and managed her own life for decades. Historians and psychologists who later examined every scrap of evidence reached the same conclusion. There is no credible proof, none, that Carrie Buck ever had an intellectual disability. Second, the court swallowed the so-called 3 generations argument. They were told feeble-mindedness ran in the blood. Emma, Carrie, and now baby Vivian. Emma's only crime was being poor, abandoned, and forced to scrape by as a servant. She was locked away with no real psychological exam, just gossip, poverty, and the era's terror of unfit women. Thousands like her were swept into institutions for the same reasons. There was never solid evidence of hereditary defect in the family. Third, they pointed to Carrie's baby, little Vivian, as living proof. One nurse claimed the infant wasn't quite normal. That single glance became gospel. Yet Vivian went on to attend regular public school. Her report cards showed average to above average marks. Her teachers described a bright, normal little girl. She died at 8, not from any disability, but from ordinary childhood illness. The defective grandchild never existed. Fourth, they said Carrie's out-of-wedlock pregnancy proved her moral and mental failure. The truth is far darker. At 17, Carrie was raped by a relative of her foster family. The Dobbses, desperate to hide the assault and avoid scandal, had her committed instead of protecting her. The pregnancy was not evidence of weakness, it was evidence of violence and betrayal. Finally, the court believed it was witnessing a fair legal process. It was anything but. Carrie's own lawyer, Irving Whitehead, was a close friend of the Virginia colony and a believer in eugenics. He called no real witnesses, challenged no evidence, and presented no defense. The entire case was a carefully staged, friendly test case designed to rubber stamp Virginia's sterilization law. Justice never showed up that day. So when Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote those infamous words, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough," he was not speaking truth. He was repeating a story woven from poverty, shame, rape, and deliberate silence. A story that destroyed Carrie Buck's future, her reputation, and her right to decide whether she would ever have another child. And that is the real tragedy we still carry today, because Buck versus Bell has never been overturned.